At this section, we'll look how Herbert Hoover reacted as things got worse in 1931 and 1932. We'll see how Hoover actually enacted a bit of government activism, but it didn't prove sufficient. In After the 1930 elections, things first got bad quickly. In the spring of 1931, the international financial panic began when the French, watching what happened in the United States, decided to call on their loans and money owed them from Germany and Austria. And this closed and not surprisingly bankrupted Austria's leading banks and led to an overall European panic. Britain went off the gold standard, devaluating their money, and Europeans all over began to sell their stocks and land that they had in the United States. And in response to all this, Hoover proposed a one-year moratorium on payments on the European debt. Now, again, that was payments that Britain and France, others owed the United States. Hoover recognized that because Germany and Austria owed almost $1 billion, still, that demanding complete payment would probably further bankrupt them. But it was a contentious decision. Some people were demanding complete cancellation of the loans, while others demanded payment in full. And Hoover delayed the decision probably too long. He didn't propose the moratorium until June 1931, and by that point there had already been a number of runs on the banks. Still clinging to his voluntary policies, Hoover summoned 30 leading New York bankers and insurance executives to the White House. He got them once again to promise to voluntarily not, foreclose mortgages, not to cut wages, not to cut payments, and he also got them to create something known as a National Credit Corporation. It was all of these businesses would pool some of their money for an emergency credit pool to assist shaky banks. So when banks had problems, they could go to the National Credit Corporation and get cheap money from their fellow banks to stay afloat. Hoover, however, was he was getting very worried because the 1932 elections were approaching and he wanted to be reelected. And, he had his conservative philosophy, and he'd asked businesses to voluntarily do all these things, but it hadn't really stemmed the tide. The Depression was continuing to get worse. And again, he'd lost those seats in the 1930 off-year congressional elections. Well, Hoover was also arguably beginning to worry that, my goodness, the American system itself could collapse. And so, he is going to begin to do things he wouldn't have done before. Whether he believed the system itself was crumbling or whether he's just trying to save his political hide in his reelection, he began to do things that he never would have done before the Depression. For example, he agreed to transfer more funds to public works. Now that means, tax-supported jobs, building roads and stuff. Not something you think of a Republican conservative necessarily supporting. Democrats wanted more, but the end result was that Hoover ended up accepting $2 billion, and as he accepted, agreed to spend it. He still warned that it was leading to socialism and collectivism. He was worried about the debt, however, and he also proposed a tax increase to help balance the budget. And, he argued that as that was going to increase spending, he didn't want to go too deep in debt. But arguably, raising taxes at that point also had a negative economic impact. It was a tough political decision since tax increases are never popular, but, he was already on weak political ground. As I just said, Hoover had created the National Credit Corporation to get private businesses to pool their money to loan money to banks that were in danger of falling apart, but it was very quickly evident that that wasn't enough. And so again, Hoover embarked on something he never would have done had the 1932 elections not been around the corner. He proposed the Federal Home Loan Bank Act. Now what that did was that created, special federal home loan banks, federal banks that could loan money to these troubled banks. And, it was tax supported in that way. And again, that's not something a conservative would do. It helped, but it didn't have enough. Hoover didn't ask for enough capital to make, to stem the tide. It didn't have enough money to make loans necessary to stop the problem. The cornerstone of Hoover's new program, again, which he felt uncomfortable launching, was the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, the RFC. It had capital of $500 million with the authority to borrow an additional $1.5 billion, and it would loan money to banks and large businesses to keep them from going under. Democrats criticized it as a millionaire's dole and demanded more federal spending on relief directly. Now, they wanted more money for the type of public works that he had acquiesced on, but they thought insufficient. The Republicans at the same time were decrying the Reconstruction Finance Corporation as, quote, the most decided step towards communism any civilized government has ever taken, with the possible exception of Russia, unquote. So, Hoover was getting criticism from the Democrats and from his fellow Republicans. Hoover was fighting for his own political life. He agreed philosophically with the Republicans, but people were hurting, and the government, he believed, had to loan some money, more money, and it just wasn't enough. Lastly, Hoover agreed to the Glass-Steagall Act of 1932. It was passed in February 1932, and it made new government bonds and other types of commercial paper collateral in the place of Federal Reserve notes, or simply put, dollars. It meant that $750 million additional dollars of gold reserves were available for loans to businesses, and this helped, the government expand the money in circulation. And we talked about the Federal Reserve in previous lectures. An expanded monetary system can help lower unemployment. Hoover, again, did not like doing this, but accepted it reluctantly, fearful that it would lead to inflation. Like the Federal Reserve, he was too conservative in that regard. Throughout it all, Hoover still refused direct government handouts. In July 1932, when Congress passed a bill vastly increasing public works and providing a direct or free aid to individuals, Hoover vetoed it as impractical. Hoover's program, although being uncomfortably radical for him, it was obviously not up to ending the Depression. The entire Western world's economy remained in chaos, hampering extension of credit and, more importantly, international trade. And just as the economists had predicted, the wholly smooth tariff, again high for farmers, led to a reaction by Europeans and a full-fledged trade war, further hurting the U.S. economy. Again, their destruction of the circular debt, the devolution of the Dawes Plan didn't help. Moreover, Hoover's program was arguably never adequately funded. The Reconstruction Finance Corporation was slow to spend money. In 1932, it lent only $30 million out, and that just wasn't enough. Of the public works programs Hoover reluctantly had agreed to, only 20% of the funding initially resulted in construction contracts. As noted, Hoover was always worried about the debt, so he refused to agree to more massive spending. Public works, what little funds it did pass, would only be spent on projects that would pay for themselves, for example, toll roads, and not necessarily projects that were the most needed to create the most jobs. As we've already noted, Hoover refused direct handouts, always loans, never handouts. In effect, this often meant that many of the people who needed aid the most didn't get it. Hoover continued to insist that to give direct handouts would undermine the Protestant work ethic and be bad long term. This concludes Herbert Hoover's reaction to the Great Depression.